Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm David French with Curtis Chang. We've got an outstanding podcast for you today, and we've got a guest. Once again, this is a guest that comes through Curtis. I'm starting to feel like I'm falling down on the job, Curtis.
I'm carrying you, David. Come on.
You are carrying. But in all fairness, I did bring in every guest when you were on sabbatical. So
this is true.
I built some up. I had a reservoir of guests. But I'm really excited about our guest today. Why don't you introduce him, Curtis?
Yes, our guest is James Choi. He's professor of finance at Yale University. My path first crossed with James when he was an undergraduate at Harvard, and I was on campus ministry at Harvard. And I think our paths crossed. We haven't stayed in very close contact, but I've tracked his career because I work with Christian intellectuals, and I've always been fascinated with James's career path. And the reason why I'm fascinated is because I knew him in our campus ministry work. And I have to say that, I don't think this was conscious or intentional, but in our campus ministry, I would say in retrospect, there was something of an implicit, subtle hierarchy of like careers that were validated to go into. Again, not conscious, but but if you had to construct one, they're probably implicit somewhere in there was like ministry is first, then public service or nonprofit work or teaching, things like that. And I would say in that hierarchy, somewhere on the bottom probably would be going into finance. Not that we thought finance was evil by itself, but it was just sort of tainted with, you shall not, the root of all evil is the love of money, right? And so like finance is all about money. And so I would say that, there was something of a bias against in our ministry of Christians going into finance. But knowing what I know about James and both because of people I know who know him, and also sort of what I saw him do in his own academic career, it's become quite evident to me that James, actually, his faith very much informed his path going into finance, and even some of the research that he does. And so we're going to get into that. We're going to get into the substance of his research and findings, especially a recent paper that he wrote that I think is especially interesting, especially for Christians. But before we do that, James, I wanted to welcome you. And then I wanted to, first of all, we should just welcome you. Welcome, James.
Thank you. I should say that, when Curtis gave his talks to my student fellowship at Harvard, it was just legendary, that he was just so engaging. And I'll also confess, Curtis, that I don't remember a single thing that you said during your talks. And just really proves the adage that, people will not remember what you say, but they'll remember how you make them feel. And I still remember how you made me feel.
Oh, okay. Let's hang on to that point because I know we're going to come back to that. But thank you so much for saying that. In fact, I think we should just end the podcast now, David. I think we've hit the high point of the podcast and we've gotten really the content that we need from James. And we could just call this a wrap. No, thank you. That's kind of you to say that. And so, let's start with this. Can you introduce your kind of yourself through the lens of like what motivated you to go into the field of finance and become a leading expert in the field? And I should say, James's work has been widely recognized as very influential in this field. He's a 2 times winner of the Paul Samuelson Award for best scholarly writing in the field, in at least a field of financial security. His work, especially on designing corporate pension plans, has influenced the corporate worldwide. And so we're talking to a world leading expert in finance. And so the fact that he's a very devout, dedicated Christian, I want you to connect the dots, James. How did your faith kind of lead you into finance? And then we'll go from there.
Yes. I don't want to over spiritualize the process by which this happened. I think that sometimes we have this notion that, it has to be God speaking from a burning bush or you right. See a vision or you dream a dream and, that stuff happens. I fully believe that happens even today. But I think the process for me was kind of more mundane, more the process, kind of the unfolding of a lot of divine providence. So I think the genesis of how I ended up in this field is that I have always been really fascinated by human behavior. And so actually in middle school, I thought that I was interested in psychology. But then, I was reasonably good at math. And so I thought, well, economics is kind of like psychology with math, using math to model human behavior. And so I kind of fell into economics as a major. And then my sophomore year, I got a call out of the blue for a job that I hadn't applied for. So I had dropped my resume file off in the economics department at Harvard, and I was told when I dropped my resume off, oh, you can do that, but nobody looks at this resume file. I said, okay, that's fine. I'm already here. I printed out my resume. I'll put it in the file. And then months later, I got a call from a professor who I had taken microeconomics with, and he offered me a job to be a research assistant, which essentially was doing data entry for about 60 hours a week for a summer in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
I loved it. I honestly loved it. It was life-changing. And so that's kind of was my introduction to research. And then, I spent a year out of college as a management consultant. So I was in the business world, but I was thinking about kind of coming back into academia because, frankly, the real world's kind of a hard place and not so interesting, I discovered. And I get another call out of the blue from the same professor saying, hey, look, I came across all this retirement savings plan data. Would you like to come back and work for me full-time on this data? And by the way, we'll make you a co-author on these papers. And so that was the start of how I began working on retirement savings. And it wasn't that I had kind of this intent to necessarily go into finance, but it just turned out that the financial realm was a good laboratory in which you could study human behavior and kind of the weird things that we do when it comes to economic decision making. And so that was kind of my path into researching finance. And I do think that there were kind of these providential events that occurred along the way that brought me into the field. And I feel lucky that I do feel like the work has had a real human connection, that I can kind of draw the line from things that I've researched to things that have affected people's lives, hopefully for the better, but certainly it's not like something that's extremely abstract where you kind of wonder, hey, is this doing anything for anybody? Does anybody care about this? We're talking about retirement savings, investing, that sort of thing. And so the human connection is pretty apparent.
I love that you said, I don't want to over spiritualize this, because a lot of career paths, I think, kind of get over spiritualized. People ask me why I went to law school. And my short answer to that is I was graduating with an undergraduate degree in political science in 1991. And I didn't have a lot of options. Law school was an option expanding choice for me. So it wasn't like I felt called, from on high to become a Christian lawyer. It was, this kind of just makes sense.
Yeah. And I think, one thing that kind of made me feel a lot better about this as an undergraduate and as a young Christian, I think that there is a little bit of an expectation that, if I'm not hearing that voice from the burning bush, I'm not doing this right. And I remember coming across this passage in 1 Corinthians where Paul is talking about, should you get married or not? And, this is only like one of the biggest decisions in your life. Paul's like, well, you can get married or you can not get married. It's kind of up to you. Either way is okay. And it's like, oh, wow, like that's pretty radical that sometimes God does call you to something very specific with a very specific vision. But, for a lot of people, it's, hey, like, here's some boundaries that I want you to play within. But within those boundaries, you can kind of follow your heart, follow the circumstances that I've laid out. And I think that's really the more common course in life.
I want to go ahead and I'm just so eager to talk to you based on, I remember reading the Atlantic article from last month, and we can put it, and we'll put it into show notes. And it's by one of my favorite writers, Derek Thompson at the Atlantic, just a guy, you should really follow him if you want to follow thoughtful reporters and analysts in this world. Derek Thompson is outstanding. And the provocative title, all the personal finance books are wrong. And here's the subtitle: They tend to treat their readers like fools without willpower, so you could argue they're wrong for the right reasons. It's a provocative title and a provocative subtitle, but then the article goes ahead and kind of backs it up, and it's really relying a lot on your work. So kind of give us the thesis that your thesis that caused Derek Thompson to call you, if that's how it worked.
The article by Derek Thompson was based upon a paper that I just released called Popular Personal Financial Advice versus the Professors. And the genesis of that paper was a few years ago, I started teaching a personal finance class at Yale. And so the natural thing to do is to go look for a textbook. And since there's so many books out there that give financial advice by kind of Susie Ormans, the Dave Ramseys of the world, I thought, I'll just take a look at some of these books to see if they'd be suitable for the syllabus of my course. Maybe they'd have some real world perspective that would be valuable, complement to my own ivory tower kind of perspective. So I read a few of them, and I was kind of surprised at some of the advice that was there. It was some of it was just plain factually wrong, and that disturbed me. Then there were things that just weren't factually wrong, but they were certainly at variance with what economic theory would tell you to do. So that was kind of interesting, but the semester was about to start. I had to get on with my life and put the course together. And so I picked a book and went ahead and taught the course. But the seed of the idea got planted that, hey, wouldn't it be really interesting to do a more systematic survey of what these authors are telling, what the universe of authors are telling their readers? And so I went back and kind of compiled a list of the 50 most popular personal finance books that are out there, cataloged their advice, and then compared it to what economic theory has to say. And so that was the paper that Derek Thompson then picked up on. And what he was really focusing on is the savings advice that most of these authors give, which is really at variance with what economic theory would tell you to do. So what is kind of the prudent way to live according to these authors, and not just these authors? I think this is pretty widespread common wisdom that you should be saving 10 to 15% of your income, no matter what your age is, no matter what your circumstances are, through thick and thin. If you're struggling, if you're not, 10 to 15% savings rates. Now that's really quite different from what economists would say you should do. Mm-hmm. So economists kind of start with the premise that the fifth slice of pizza that you eat is never as satisfying as the fourth slice of pizza you eat, which is never as satisfying as the third slice of pizza you eat, and so on and so forth. So basically, there are these diminishing returns to spending money on yourself within a given time period. And so instead of scrimping and scrounging and struggling one year and then kind of overindulging the next, maybe life would be more pleasant on average if you consumed a similar moderate amount in both periods. And so this is a notion of consumption smoothing. And what does that mean? It means that in your 20s, you're going to try to have a standard of living that's not too far off from what your standard of living is in your 40s. Now, for most people, they earn less money in their 20s than in their 40s. Your 40s and 50s are kind of your peak earnings years. And so what consumption smoothing implies is that your savings rate should be relatively low in your 20s, but then in your 40s, you're really going to turn on the savings jets and become a super saver. And so kind of this notion of savings rate smoothing, which is what the popular authors are advocating, really does cause you to struggle probably more in your 20s when you have low income and yet you're still trying to save your 10 to 15%. Right. But then in your 40s, you're higher income, but you're still only saving 10 to 15%. And so you're kind of having this more luxurious life in your 40s than in your 20s. And it's a fairly different vision of what the good life is, materially speaking.
James, I want to talk a little bit, I want to pull back in a moment on sort of the higher level intersection between sort of faith and popular finance. But I want to drill back into this particular issue because what you're saying makes sense, except that I hear in the back of my mind when you're saying all that, counter to that is all of these charts that are thrown out there in these popular finance books that tell you if you save this a little amount at age 20, the power of compound interest translates to this, right? Like that's the common argument for why you need to start saving meaningfully very young, because it has an outsized impact. How do economists respond to that popular logic?
Yeah, the economic models actually take that into account. They take the power of compound interest into account. And so if you dig into the weeds a little bit more, most economic models wouldn't say that you should have exactly the same standard of living in your 20s and your 40s. You should defer some gratification. And so you should live a little bit better in your 40s than your 20s to take into account that kind of that power of compound interest. But it's not going to be kind of this drastic or as drastic of a change over time as you would have if you were just saving 10 to 15% of your income consistently over time. So yeah, that's all kind of taken into account in the economic models.
Well, I'm just feeling vindicated because all I know is when I was in my 20s, that 10% savings thing was a no-go for me because it stood in the way of things like a ski trip. Right? But I was really interested in this part of the piece. And this is Thompson's words. And he says, this might be the deepest takeaway of Choi's paper. Personal finance bestsellers succeed by blending theory and psychology in a way that takes human nature seriously and thus deserves the respect of economic professors. In other words, the popular advice is really sort of dealing and grappling seriously with the idea that people are prone to overindulge and they have to introduce self-discipline, and self-discipline's hard. Delayed gratification is hard. But then Thompson goes on and says, but those who spend a lifetime delaying gratification may one day find themselves rich in savings, but poor in memories, having sacrificed too much joy at the altar of compounding interest. And that reminded me of a statement I heard some time ago that we've sort of adopted in our family, which was, if you're spending money, it's better to spend money on experiences rather than things. And that statement, you've having sacrificed too much joy at the altar of compounding, poor in memories, having sacrificed too much joy at the altar of compounding interest, really stood out to me. And I know that's Thompson, but is that a sort of a fundamental takeaway here about what it sort of means to live a life that is rich in experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is. I mean, I think that he had a very poetic way of putting it, but just thinking back to thinking back to my 20s, this is a time where a lot of my friends were getting married, and of course, they're getting married all over the country, and I could have. Now, I was a PhD student living on a small PhD student stipend for most of my 20s, and I could have said, I need to save my 15%. I'm not going to go to your wedding because I can't afford the $1,000 it's going to cost me to fly across the country, stay in a hotel, get you a gift, et cetera, right? But no, I mean, I did go to almost all my close friends' weddings, and I think it was totally worth it. And so I will come back to the fact that I did save a positive amount of money during my PhD years, which is actually contrary to what economic theory has to prescribe. So I'll come back to that in a second. But let me defend the popular author's advice for a little bit. And you alluded to this a little bit, which is there's this pervasive notion that savings is a discipline. It's a habit that needs to be built. It's this kind of notion that goes back to Aristotle, that you have to build virtues, and you become the type of person who saves, who's frugal, who lives within their means. And the only way to do that is to consistently do it throughout your entire life. And so this economist notion that you're just not going to save hardly anything at all in your 20s, and then suddenly in your 40s, you're going to become the super saver. The popular authors say, look, human psychology doesn't work that way. You're not going to be able to become a super saver in your 40s if you weren't that way in your 20s. So, there may be something to that. I don't think that's been kind of scientifically tested, but it doesn't seem like a crazy notion to me. So I think there is, as Derek Thompson was alluding to, this limited human ability to stick to a financial plan, to execute. And maybe the best advice is not the advice that a robot could follow, but you kind of distort your advice to a second best solution, right, because that's what actual human beings with frailties can follow. So that's kind of in defense of the popular authors. Now, going back to the fact that I saved a positive amount in my 20s, I will say that it didn't feel like a hardship at all, because at that time I was living with other people and hanging out with other people that had relatively low incomes or were just living very frugally. And so we just did cheap stuff. And I lived with, 4, 5, sometimes 7, 8 other people in a house. And it was fine. It was normal. It didn't feel like a deprivation. So there was something about kind of the coordination of your expenditure level or your lifestyle with your peer group, which I think is a very important consideration. And so I did not follow the economic prescription of having zero savings and even having a lot of debt in my 20s, and it felt fine. So you can kind of do what I did or do what I say. They're two different things.
So I wanted to, I like your notion that, what you're talking about, swimming around here is the notion of formation. It is not just pure, at that moment, what is rationally the most economically optimal decision to make, but we're also in the process of being formed and trying to form our character and our virtue. So I have a question then. This is actually for both David and you, James. I'm going to turn it first to David, then James, you can pick it up. But I would say in many churches, the formation of one's financial virtues is happening very weakly. That, it's not happening very strongly. It's not happening on a weekly basis. I mean, weekly, W-E-A-K-L-Y, and that that finances in churches is not something that people share about. It's not like in your small group, you may share like, hey, I'm really struggling with this issue or this personal issue, but you wouldn't share your budget, for instance, right? Like it's off limits in the realm of discipleship in many Christian communities. And therefore, because we're not in our churches, we're not really actively forming people's financial virtues. We're sort of outsourcing that. We're letting that be outsourced by other voices in our culture. And the best version of that would be, okay, we're going to outsource it at least to Christian voices. So this is where you get the rise of sort of Christian financial gurus, Dave Ramsey being the most one of the most popular ones. And I wanted to explore some, like, is that a no good thing? Is that, and what is the effects of that? Especially because, David, I think you yourself were influenced by Dave Ramsey in some of your financial practices. Like, what does it do when we give to these sort of individual guru-like figures this kind of outsized influence in the formation of financial virtues, and it's taken outside the realm of the church and immediate relationships?
Yeah, my experience is a little bit different from the sort of the outsourcing. It was combination outsourcing, insourcing, in the sense that a church would say, they would bring in Dave Ramsey to Sunday school, for example. So this was part of the Sunday school curriculum. So it wasn't just that they would say, leave it alone. They would say, here is the curriculum. Right. And not every church I've attended, but I've attended more than one church where Dave Ramsey curriculum was part of Sunday school, for example. In our particular situation, when I was in Iraq, Nancy used the Dave Ramsey debt snowball to pay off the last bit of household debt other than like our mortgage, and was really helpful for us because it introduced that element of self-discipline that James talked about earlier, and which I thought was really interesting and thoughtful about the James's answer just there, and also the piece in the Atlantic is, it's not that you should look at that advice that is really talking about building self-discipline and dismiss it. There's a balance. And so that element of self-discipline was actually important for us. Absolutely. But the thing that I would say, Curtis, my experience, and it'd be interesting to see if this is James's experience. Here's my experience. My experience is from the pulpit, people talked about finance a lot more, and then they talked about things like politics, for example. Political formation was just completely punted to the outside world.
Yeah.
Financial formation, everything from tithing to sort of like the saving habits and self-discipline was kind of part of a holistic church experience, with one exception, which was nobody talked about their own finances. Like nobody would talk about that. And I don't know, I've spent a lot of my life in various men's groups, and you know what is the one thing nobody talks about in a men's group?
Yeah.
Personal finances, right? Unless there's some sort of urgent, massive emergency, like a business is going under or something like that. But I'd be very interested in James's experience as to what was your experience, James, and how did your church talk to its congregants, and what was your experience in churches about how churches spoke to congregants about financial responsibility?
I think that what you described is not too far off from my own experience. I've not been a member of very many churches because I haven't lived in very many places.
Right.
I certainly think that there's a great deal of kind of a privacy veil over personal finances, and even from the pulpit, I think the teaching I've heard has been relatively general. I think. I have heard of churches where the members of some, small group, cell group are supposed to actually open up their entire household balance sheet and kind of have accountability. And I've had the impression that those types of churches are kind of at some elevated risk of kind of bad things happening, because often there's a very kind of controlling aspect of the ministry that I think is, starts off well intentioned, and then it just has a lot of potential to kind of go awry. So I think there is something maybe tragic about the fact that you do think that the church should be involved in this, because this is so important. And yet when churches do become very involved in the personal finances at kind of the individual level, I think there's still a lot of risks that kind of come up.
Well, because
in
some ways, because in some ways, institutionally, the church is an interested party, right? Like it's wanting tithes and giving,
Exactly.
and so that's difficult. I would say that I have more hope and good experiences with this happening in a tight, trusted relational circles, not institutionalized necessarily in a particular church. And as much as I'm a fan of institutions, I think there are some things that are just much better done through like small, very small, tight communities. So one of them is, we talked about this in a previous podcast, James. I don't know if you remember Andy Crouch from our university days. Yeah.
Speaking of people whose careers I've followed over the years.
Totally.
Andy has been very visible, of course.
Yeah. Well, so he was a guest on our previous podcast, and I shared about this, or we shared together about this experience where Andy, myself, and two other guys living over, if you remember, the 30 Mount Auburn sort of household we had there, where we actually went to the radical extreme of having all things in common. So for 2 years we lived with pooling all of our money. We helped pay each other's off student debts. We helped kind of monitor each other's sort of decisions, make sure they were wise. We got permission either at the $10 mark or the $15 mark. Andy and I remember it differently. But it was a formational experience for me, and challenging also. I think it really exposed to me actually how deeply individualistic my attitudes towards money were. So that was one in my early 20s. And then in my mid 30s, my wife and I also felt like, we're starting to make more and more money, but there's no corresponding level of partnership, accountability, community that goes with this more and more money. And that just feels like there's something potentially dangerous in that regard. And so we covenanted with another couple where every year we would just open the books. We would share our annual budget to one another and invite questions, invite scrutiny, invite accountability, and so forth. And that went well, but that only lasted for a few years. It was really hard to sort of sustain that. We just sort of drifted from that. And I've wondered since then, as my income has continued to kind of follow the normal path of increase as you hit into your 40s and into your 50s, that I've been wondering, like, how do I bring that same level of community and partnership in a healthy way, in a way that doesn't get, sort of weird or toxic or something like that. And I don't see a lot of good models for that. And I still think we are, as Christians, very much locked into this highly individualistic, or at least family unit-ish, definition of individualism approach to finances. And I'm really, at least I'm curious and interested in other ways we can go about doing that. So let me ask you, James, then let me turn back to you. Like, what are other common mistakes that you think Christians make in their financial thinking? You said like getting our savings calculus wrong is one of them. Are there others that you've seen that, like, we're not necessarily thinking about this in the right way, either from an economic perspective or from a spiritual perspective?
Well, so, I haven't done a survey of Christians and how they think about finances, nor have I read one, although maybe these exist. I think probably the most dire mistake that I do actually, I'm fairly confident that a lot of Christians make with regards to finance is believing in the prosperity gospel. Right? You're going to be faithful to God, and God is going to make you rich. It's like, my gosh, like it's in the Bible. No, people who think godliness means spiritual gain, they're robbed of the truth, and Paul writes that in 1 Timothy. And yet you have these enormous prosperity gospel movements, and you can turn on the TV and there'll be some televangelist that kind of says, give me money, and you're, it's just fairly disturbing. And so that's, maybe a little too, well, a lot of people believe it, so I won't say that it's obvious, but to me, that's the most glaring example of a serious error. Even the secular economists would say that's an error. Never mind just kind of, us on this podcast. So I think that's kind of, something that you might expect even your pastor to identify as an error. Let me talk about something that maybe your pastor wouldn't talk about because it's kind of more in the realm of economists speak or economists think, which is just the relationship with debt. Like, how do we think about debt? And I think that there is a pretty strong streak in, like, say, Dave Ramsey's writings and thinking that is kind of very, very anti-debt. And I think that I have a much more benign view of debt. I mean, of course, people do get into trouble with debt, and you should be careful when you think about going into debt, because the Bible says that when you go into debt, you do put yourself kind of under the yoke of somebody else. So definitely there is a bit of a yielding of power that happens when you go into debt. But debt is this incredibly powerful tool. I mean, so there's a reason why every civilization that has ever existed that had any kind of major accomplishment has a financial system. Basically, and what is the cockroach of finance? What is the horseshoe crab of finance? It's debt, because debt is this incredibly robust contractual form that can thrive in environments that have kind of low, kind of poor quality legal institutions and norms and that sort of thing. And so that's why debt is, there's serious arguments that debt predates currency, that in fact writing was developed to keep track of debts. And so it was just so foundational to civilization that it's kind of hard to really operate without it. And so, basically, if you're thinking about the perspective of an individual person, well, you're going to earn a certain amount of money over the course of your life. And you'd really like to buy a house. And a house is a lot of money. And even though over the course of my life, I'll earn more than enough money to afford this particular house, well, I just don't happen to have that money right now. So one approach would be like, okay, well, why don't you just wait? And when you're 55 years old, that's when you can buy your house and you'll be debt free your entire life. It's one way to live. And certainly many, many generations of people lived that way. But, the other way to live is, well, we have faith that you're going to actually earn enough money someday to buy this entire house. So we're going to lend you that money up front, and you can go live in this house that you own. So I think that, there's a very positive aspect to debt in certain circumstances. Of course, just have people do abuse debt and overuse it as well and get into serious trouble and stress and so it's a two-edged sword.
So let me ask you about. So one of the things we talked about is habits for saving, and how a lot of the sort of the more pop culture advice about personal finance, to the extent that it airs on the side of savings, but in maybe a defensible way because of building discipline. What would the sort of economists, what would professors say about giving and patterns and habits of giving? Is that something that would evolve over time as well, or is that something that has a kind of a different calculus, or would a sort of a Christian, if you're, let's say you're looking at it from a economist approaching things from a more utilitarian point of view of sort of maximizing happiness and meaning, would they offer different advice than say a Christian economist who's got maybe a different lens on maximizing sacrificial generosity? So how does this sort of play out in your mind?
I think for most of economics, there's a huge amount of respect for the preferences of the individual as revealed by whatever they're choosing. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, economists say, if you want to give, you can give. If you don't want to give, you don't have to give. It's up to you. And we just think about you as maximizing your utility, your happiness, right. and it is what it is. So I don't think that economics as a discipline, for the most part, has much of an opinion about how mm-hmm. much you should give or building a giving habit or anything like that. I mean, there are studies on how can fundraising organizations maximize the gifts that they receive, so matching gifts, challenge gifts, silent phase, this sort of thing. That's I think a different thing. That's more on kind of the demand side for charitable donations rather than the supply side of me writing a check to my church or the Salvation Army or what have you. So I think that now we're really kind of going back into the realm of our lived experience, prudential wisdom, stuff you read in Scripture. Yeah. And I do personally think that there is a habit of giving and a virtue of giving that's built because I do think that your desires can always expand to meet any sort of budget. So, I teach at Yale University. We're a rich institution. Mm-hmm. And you would be amazed at how many conversations are had around here about, we need more revenue. It's like, yeah. Gosh, we have a lot of money here, but we need more revenue. Okay, I guess, we have if we don't do something, there'll be a $3 million budget deficit this year. But my gosh, we have a $49 billion endowment. But anyway, you can always spend to meet and exceed any kind of budget that you set for yourself. And so I do think that as I think back to my 20s where I was living on a $15,000 PhD stipend, I gave, and I think that was a really, really good thing for me. Mm-hmm. And yet there were unhealthy aspects of it too, and that somehow I felt like, oh my gosh, I'm this hero for giving money while I'm living on a PhD stipend. God does not need my money. Okay, so it was for me, the few dollars I was able to give, that was mostly for me in my spiritual well-being, rather than this, really moving the needle necessarily on ministry. Although who knows? We'll find out someday before the judgment throne. But
James, I do
think that.
No, go. I was just going to say, I really love this sort of, just sort of exposure of the fact that one of the things that needs to get exposed is just how much our consumption habits expand to meet our available revenue. I've definitely seen that over and over in my own life, in the lives of others. And you actually bring up a really great point. We see it writ large in human nature, writ large in institutions, such that you have Yale, or when I get the alumni fundraising office call from Harvard, I'm like, that's a pretty short conversation over the phone for me, because you do not need, more money with the world's largest endowment. And yet you still hear this language, we need more money, which just shows that if you let your own self-perceived notion of need drive kind of what is actually your own, is the actual sense of need, is you're going to get distorted, right? So we talked a lot about some different aspects of financial life and the ways in which it intersects with the gospel, spending, saving, giving, and all the nuances. I want to raise one more category, James, for your reflection, which is investing. And the reason for that is because whereas I may not, it sounds like we may not always agree with like the Christian advice on something like debt or something like that, at least there is advice on that. At least there is an attempt to help Christians think more faithfully and biblically about that financial practice of getting free from debt. What I find is, and there's certainly plenty of Christian voices on giving, trying to motivate people on giving. And I think there's some, I think there could be more on how to discipline and restrain our spending. But I find a real paucity of thoughtful Christian voices guiding Christians on investing, that it just feels like the standard assumption is, well, Christians will invest just like any non-Christian would invest. We're just seeking our highest return, and that's end of story. And I wanted to ask you, is there a way in which Christians ought to think differently? Because they are Christians, they ought to think differently about investment.
So I think in principle, yes, but I'm going to actually come down on a relatively, I think, conventional conclusion, which is just my own idiosyncratic reasoning about this. But I think there's a real analogy here to meat sacrificed to idols, coming back to 1 Corinthians, which really is one of my favorite books in the Bible. So I think that, Christians back in the day faced this real problem that, hey, there's this stuff happening in the meat market, which is like a pretty just basic institution at the time. And that's where you got your food. And this meat is sacrificed to idols. And we think that's like against our beliefs and it's wrong. And can I eat this meat that's been sacrificed to idols? And Paul kind of says, well, if you just accept the meat and don't ask questions about it, and it's okay, you can eat the meat that has been sacrificed to idols, unless somebody kind of points out to you, hey, like, here's this meat sacrificed to idols, would you like to have some? In which case, well, like maybe you shouldn't, right? So it's a complicated thing, but I think when it comes to investing in our current environment, there is this aspect where someone tries to pitch you an individual stock. Hey, here's this company that's doing really immoral things, but I think that the market is undervaluing it right now. Would you like to invest in this stock? Then you might have to kind of say as a Christian, no, I can't support that. But then if you think about investing in an S&P 500 index fund or an ETF, what are these financial instruments trying to do? They're just trying to invest in kind of the overall direction and profitability of the economy as a whole. And kind of anything specific that any individual company is doing or not doing, that's kind of getting washed out in the diversification mix. And so even though the components consist of these individual companies, which are kind of varying degrees of virtue, the intention is that you're just investing in the overall economy. And so I kind of do think about the investing problem as being, you can invest in the index, and it's like the meat that's been sacrificed to idols in the market. And I think it's very hard to divorce yourself from the world and its fallenness. And, so take the example of fossil fuels. So of course, this is a big thing now where we're not going to invest in fossil fuel producers. So, that's a defensible moral starting point. But then, okay, well, here's a software company that is benefiting from an uninterrupted low-cost supply of electricity. Right. So they are complicit, even though they're not involved in the production of the energy itself. And so, you really go down the rabbit hole, it's really hard to disentangle yourself from the entire economy. And so I kind of do think about kind of divorcing these two domains, maybe, where you do push for policies that promote the good in society, but that it's okay to invest in the S&P 500 index fund and not ask or be too concerned about individual companies in there that you might want to delete from the index.
There's an interesting parallel there between investment and consumption. So, the whole concept of, for example, a consumer boycott. I remember one memorable moment. I addressed the National Convention for Students for Life for America, and this is several years ago. And I walked up there, and I had a cup of coffee with me, and I didn't think anything about it. Like I had a cup of coffee rather than a bottle of water to sort of, keep my throat dry while I spoke. And after it's over, the speech went well. I was very pleased with it. And the first 2 or 3 people who came up to talk to me after the speech were livid at me because my cup of coffee was Starbucks. And I hadn't known it, but Starbucks had apparently donated some money to Planned Parenthood. And so they took the fact that I had the Starbucks cup as evidence of insufficient support for the cause of life. And I didn't even know about it. There was just a Starbucks in the lobby of the hotel, right? Does that, in my view, was nobody was wrong there. There might have been maybe a little bit giving me too little grace problem, but to say I don't want to buy Starbucks because I know Starbucks supports Planned Parenthood, I'm not going to object to that. But then to turn around and say, but for me to purchase Starbucks is also not fundamentally, inherently, morally flawed. Because, one of the questions that I asked in response was, okay, where should I have gotten my coffee? And they said, well, there's a coffee shop right down the street. I said, what are their beliefs? I don't know. I said, do you know if they donated to Planned Parenthood or not? I don't know. They could have donated more, you're saying, right? As a percentage, maybe. So there's kind of a sense at which you can really go down the rabbit hole. But at the same time, if you know something like Starbucks donated to Planned Parenthood, what do you do with that? It strikes me that we could have, not really a question here, just a little mini rant. It strikes me that we could have a lot more grace for each other on those matters.
Well, I think there's a long history of utopian communities that try to withdraw from the world and have a very morally pure kind of existence. And these utopian communities usually end benignly or not so benignly. And so I think it's very difficult to maintain these things. And kind of going back to your arrangement, Curtis, with Andy right out of college, with having everything in common, or these accountability partnerships with another couple. I mean, I think they can be very helpful, but as you pointed out, it was very temporary. And even in the early church, this chapter about the believers having everything in common, my read of Acts is that was a pretty temporary state, and you kind of go out a few years. I don't know exactly how long. I mean, you're kind of back to they were not kind of living in communes, as far as I can tell.
And Curtis doesn't still live in a commune either.
I do not.
I am still gobsmacked by that. Like, what was the dollar threshold was what again?
I remember as 10. Andy says it was 15. But yes, the idea was that we could spend anything we wanted under that particular amount, but over that amount, we wanted to actually bring that into the.
I could not live under
this
that.
Is 1990, 92.
The thumb of 92. $10 is still I could not have lived under that thumb of communitarian tyranny. I just tell you.
So I actually want to ask sort of this along this line, because I think what I'm picking up from this conversation is the idea that, look, money in some ways reflects just human reality, both in terms of what the good of what human beings can do, the fallenness of human beings. And so you can't ever, and partly what it means to be involved in human life is to touch money and all of the fallen and necessarily impure things. I mean, this is where, James, I like your sort of echo of the Corinthians passage. It's like, we can't operate with clean hands thinking that that's what saves us, is that our behavior of keeping absolutely pristine hands, and that extends even to our money. We're going to be touching fallen human structures, and that involves fallen human financial practices and realities. And so I really like that, just that element of both humility and grace that I think is present in that recognition. I want to follow this theme of, though, like, hey, if you have to engage in money, if you're going to engage in the world, because and this maybe circles back to my original observation of you, James, is that you are one of the Christians that I know that I really like. I'm really glad James is a Christian and in the world of finance, and he's bringing his insights, perspectives to bear, I think in a really appropriate way. You are also training and teaching students to go into the world of finance. I know you yourself did not spend much time in the world of professional, private, or corporate finance, but you are training and teaching, and mentoring people who are. Help us think about that. Like, why? Help me help articulate why you think it's so important for Christians to have a voice and have a presence in the world of finance. Why are you teaching your students to do that? I mean, I know obviously not all of them are Christians, but some of them are. Like, how do you help Christians make sense of the fact that, hey, I need to enter the world. I may be called, or I just may be drawn into the world of finance. And what does that mean to bring my faith to bear into that world?
I think it goes back to this recognition, first of all, that civilization cannot function without finance. That's why, everybody hates bankers, and yet we have banks in every major civilization, and you try to kind of get rid of the banks, and they just come back, because you just can't do anything of major civilizational significance without kind of the matching of capital suppliers to capital demanders, which essentially is what a bank does. It is kind of a matching function. So as I think about kind of my approach to teaching corporate finance, which is what I did for about a decade. Now I teach a personal finance course, as I mentioned before. On the corporate side, one of the things I told my students at the very beginning of the course is, you as Yale graduates will not face a scarcity of opportunity in finance, but you will face a scarcity of meaning. So I want to really impart on you an understanding in this course of what societal purpose is being fulfilled by these particular corporate finance instruments or these particular securities. And so you need to know what is the good that could be accomplished in the finance industry. And so in what way can you see yourself actually serving people? And then, first of all, that'll help you just have motivation to get up and go to the job each day, besides just the paycheck. And then I think it can provide some guidance as to, hey, I might want to act in this way or build this type of business within the industry versus others where I'm like, I understand what finance is supposed to be for. I don't actually see how this innovation that somebody's thinking about doing or I'm thinking about doing actually serves that purpose of the greater good. And so that's kind of the perspective that I tried to instill on people. And I did use historical examples from thousands of years ago. Why do we need bankers thousands of years ago? Well, this and that, and it was a much simpler setting back then. And you say, well, it's actually kind of exactly the same nowadays. So kind of understand your student what it is you're actually doing when you do a bond issue as a corporation, or when you buy insurance, or whatever it might be. So I think it's kind of that vision of creation, the kind of co-creating with God, which I do believe is a very essential part of what it means for humans to be created in God's image. What does God do? God is a creator, and he calls us in the creation account to kind of subdue the earth, to be the masters of it. And that creation mandate was never repealed, even after the fall. So we're still called to co-create with God. And if in working in the finance industry, you can connect with that notion that, hey, what I'm doing is kind of creating something other than just dollars in my bank account, this is actually helping society thrive in some way, then I think that I've done a little bit of my job.
One thing that has really stood out to me, and before the start of the podcast, I said this is going to be a great podcast. I wasn't wrong, because this has been really helpful for me, because a couple of themes that or a theme that is being teased out here, from the opening statement where you said, I don't want to over spiritualize my career path, to the point where we're bringing in a lot of what you would basically practical economic wisdom. And that is that practical wisdom can also be spiritual wisdom. That we often look in churches and say, I'm looking for the specifically Christian source of insight here, and sort of neglecting the common grace of practical wisdom, and that those two things, practical wisdom and spiritual wisdom, can just be exactly the same. And it's not some sort of like new insight that's been gleaned from Scripture. It's just some of the good common sense that God has given us, can be remarkably powerful. And so that's one of my takeaways from this podcast. I've really appreciated that. And the other thing is the partial vindication of my earlier life habits, but with the emphasis on partial, because I needed more of the self-discipline than I had.
David is just trying to justify all of the medieval or fantasy swords and costumes that he purchased in his early adulthood. James, I want to close by actually asking you to tell a little bit about this thing that you did that so impressed me when I saw it, which is when I may not get the details right, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but sometime early in your career at Yale, you put up on your website, a "Why I Am a Christian" on like an official Yale website. And I actually have shared that many, many times, both for the content itself, which is excellent. It's essentially a long, very rationally sort of robust, sort of apologetic of why James is a Christian, and goes through some very sort of classic but really good, well-articulated apologetic arguments for why it's reasonable and rational. I think the subtitle is "Why I'm a Christian, but I don't believe in the Easter Bunny," or something like that. So you were basically making kind of a rational case for why Christianity is at least defensible intellectually. So I've shared it around both for the content, but also for the model, that I thought it took an enormous amount of courage. I don't know if you were tenured or non-tenured at that point. You can tell me, but either way, just from a reputational risk perspective, I thought it was an enormous act of courage. And yet, I thought if I was a Christian student at Yale, I would have taken incredible inspiration and encouragement from seeing a professor do that. So say more about what, that story behind why you did that, what other experiences, or what has come from that act that you've done. Yeah.
Actually, this ties in well to this notion of kind of these disciplines and virtues that you build as a young person, mm-hmm. even if maybe the world, from a worldly perspective, it's not a wise thing to do. So that website actually has its genesis from, I think, my sophomore year in college. So back then, the World Wide Web was a new place, and people just kind of put things up, and people weren't so curated back then. We didn't kind of know that certain things, you post something on Twitter when you're a 12-year-old, and suddenly, like 10 years later, you get canceled for it. So, I put that up, the kind of the beginnings of that, I think my sophomore year in college. And then it just was kind of continuously up on my webpage through that time. And there was never a moment where, I guess when I was going on the job market, I could have said, well, like, I'm going to take it down now. But that would have felt kind of wrong to suddenly say, oh, well, now that I'm about to apply for a job, I'm going to go undercover. And so it was just kind of up there as, kind of an inertial act. But, even kind of in those early days, I did kind of have this conviction that I should live somewhat out loud as a Christian, to not be ashamed of my faith. And also, I wouldn't say that I'm a gifted, spontaneous evangelist. So I think God has been gracious to me in that, to put it in soccer terms, I'm okay at set pieces, kind of these premeditated plays, the penalty kicks. But if freestyling, improvisation in the field, not so great. And so God has provided these set pieces for me, and that webpage is, I think, one of those set pieces. And it took me forever to actually finish the page. For many, many years, it was kind of more content to come. And then a few years ago, I finally kind of just buckled down and wrote a complete from beginning to end essay about why I think it is reasonable to be a Christian, acknowledging that, hey, there's reason to doubt. I'm not going to try to overstate the evidence, but kind of when you put it all together, this is a pretty rational thing to believe in.
Well, we'll make sure we put it in the show notes and
yes,
share it with our listeners. Yeah,
absolutely. I love that answer so much. For a long time, I speak to Christian law students. I speak to Christian students, both in secular universities and Christian universities. And there's this kind of pervasive sense that a lot of people have that they need to sort of not be publicly Christian until they reach a certain point of security, especially if they're in a more secular environment.
I think that this gets back to this notion that, once I'm rich, I will start giving. And that's possible. Right, but I think that actually it's surprisingly hard to I think, start giving at a certain point, because it just never feels like it's enough. And I don't think I can necessarily think of any examples of closeted Christians that suddenly became very, very public once they made partner at the law firm or what have you. I think that you just kind of you live in a certain way and you attain a certain position, and then you can become very afraid that it's going to get taken away.
Yeah, that's so true, because it is not like the stakes get lower the older you get, right? So a lot of people feel like, oh, well, once I achieve this or this or this, then I'll feel secure enough. No, you will have more to risk. You have more to give up than when you're saying, well, I don't want to say something publicly because I might lose a recommendation to grad school. Well, a recommendation to grad school is a lot lower stakes than partnership in a law firm, right? And so these kinds of things, we tell ourselves, well, I'll be really brave once I hit a level of security.
Yeah, I think it reminds me of something I think was told to me in my undergraduate fellowship, that if you're thinking about money and living at kind of a low standard of living so that you can be generous. But I'm going to do that later on when I'm established. Well, it's relatively easy to deprive yourself. But once you have a spouse, once you have your children, it is very hard to consciously choose to deprive your spouse and children. And so to think that you're going to dial back at that point in time, I think it's very hard.
Yeah, man, that is an awesome note to end on, and I really appreciate that. And appreciate you coming on the podcast. This has been a delightful conversation. And Curtis, you're on a roll with guests, man.
I'm on a total roll. I'm in fuego with my guests.
I might need to just entirely delegate this to you.
No, let's not do that. Well, I, as long as every guest can open with a sort of memory of myself as a public speaker and how much they remember my sermons from 30 years ago, I think that's the ticket into my heart. Anyways,
he didn't actually remember.
Yeah, just how you made me feel, Curtis, not the content whatsoever.
Okay, all right. Well,
at least I
can hang on to that.
Just to be clear. All right. Well, thank you so much, Professor.
James, has been it's great to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Just a real treat. And listeners, thanks as always for joining us. I have a great milestone to announce. We have crossed 1 million downloads. 1 million downloads in way less than a year, which is just tremendous. So thank you. This is because of you, and we're here because of you. And we never take for granted that you take time out of your days to listen to us, and we're incredibly grateful for it. And if you like what you hear, if you enjoy this podcast, please go rate us. Please subscribe. Check out my work at thedispatch.com and check out Curtis at redeemingbabel.org. And we'll be back next week.